Chapter 8. The Costs. In having the benefits of the pursuit of women calculated, we now need to move on to the price men pay for this pursuit. And as discussed in Chapter 3, these costs can be broken down across three general categories: explicit costs, opportunity costs, and intangible costs. Not all these costs have finite financial price tags attached to them. Nor does the fact that some of these costs are intangible mean that they're not real or that men do not pay/suffer them. But to provide context and reference so that men can see just what price they pay to stand a 4 in 1,000 chance at being happily married, measuring or at least acknowledging these costs is vital to calculating the ROI of the pursuit of women. Explicit costs. Explicit costs are the actual cash expenses men will incur in their pursuit of women. Some of these are obvious, like dates, dinners, cover charges, and fancy shirts. Others are not so obvious, but very real nonetheless. For example, what about college? Would men attend college anywhere near the levels they do if there were no women to woo with their engineer salaries? What about auto expenses? If you're interested in transportation, a reliable used car only costs about $4,000. But if you're looking to impress girls, like most 20-something men are, you'll gladly drop $36,000 on a new car and another $30,000 in interest payments on a car you technically can't afford. Do you waste $3,000 a month on some schwank bachelor pad to impress women, when in reality you could probably rent a room for $500 if you weren't pursuing women at all? And what about weddings, wedding rings, engagement rings, honeymoons, and the 50% guarantee you'll be paying for the divorce costs that come with them? Do these costs factor into your analysis of the pursuit of women? When you add it up, men blow an inordinate amount of money on the pursuit of women, easily 3 times what they need to survive. And so a serious, thorough calculation needs to be done estimating how much men spend that they wouldn't have otherwise had women theoretically never existed. Thankfully, the field of finance breaks down explicit costs into 3 general subcategories that will help in our calculation: pursuit costs, or acquisition costs, maintenance costs, and disposal costs. And when you consider these sub-costs, you can see just how much cash money men spend on women. Pursuit costs. Pursuit costs are considered the costs men incur when they're chasing women. This can include anything from cover charges to dating to fancy shoes, but any and all expenses they would not have incurred otherwise need to be considered. This can run the gamut, because what part of a young man's life isn't at least tangentially associated with chasing girls? Would men go out as much to the bars if there weren't girls there? What about the gas to get there? Technically, if you weren't chasing women, shouldn't all your clothes be purchased from Goodwill? Therefore, for the sake of the study, we focused on eliminating the following major expenses that would likely go away if men didn't pursue women. Average annual dating expenses, estimated at $1,855 a year. Half a man's higher education expenses. Half the annual interest costs on the average man's student loans. Additional annual car costs men incur above women. And half the cost of weddings, wedding rings, and honeymoons. Additional adjustments were made to account for young men not having as much money when they are older and other variables, but when it's all said and done, the average man can expect to pay $67,900 in pursuit costs from 18 to about 30, at which point the average man marries. This is very likely a low-end estimate, as any man will confess to easily blowing through that much money in his single years chasing girls. Maintenance costs. Just because you're married does not mean the work is over. Quite the contrary, many married men would claim this is just when the work is about to begin. And so, even though you and your beloved are married, doesn't mean the wooing, dating, courting, or expenses are over. Conservatively, your average married man still has to spend $1,600 annually on dates, taking his wife out and courting her proper. This also assumes a man will disproportionately subsidize his wife's living expenses, as women do not make as much as men, but are still going to insist on the SUV or the trampoline for the kids. Don't forget, millions of men inevitably pay for their wives' student loans. And none of these figures consider the real expenses many other men will incur keeping up with the Joneses, such as finished basements, granite countertops, boats, and the potpourri of other expenses that ensure a happy wife, happy life. But in the end, the average man can expect to shell out an additional $80,000 in lifetime maintenance costs to continue courting his wife. Again, many married men will contest this is a very, very, very low estimate. However, there is some good news. Only half of these men will incur these maintenance costs till death do them part, because the other half of men will get divorced. And though this ends the costs of maintaining a wife, it introduces a whole new set of costs: disposal costs. Disposal costs. The cost of your average divorce is surprisingly difficult to track down. It depends on the state you're in, the cost of living, what the spouse made, what the other spouse made, and a whole host of other state laws. But ever so roughly, the average man can expect a divorce rate of 50%. The average divorce will cost him $20,000 in legal fees, and the average man at the age of 40 can expect to forfeit half his estimated net worth of $125,000 to his soon-to-be ex. And this says nothing of the alimony you can expect to pay, which roughly ends up being $6,000 per year for 5 years. When you tally up the total figure, your average American man could expect a 50% chance of paying $113,000 in disposal costs. Total explicit costs. When all is said and done, starting from the age of 18 to your dying day at 78, the average man can expect to shell out in explicit cash expenses $260,785 in his pursuit, maintenance, and disposal of a woman. And this optimistically assumes you do not get married and divorced a second, third, or fourth time. Just your average man marrying once and divorcing once will spend over $250,000 in cash expenses pursuing women, almost half of which are disposal costs. Admittedly, there is a 50% chance you do not get divorced, in which case you will only incur $148,000 in lifetime expenses. But whether it's $260,000 or $148,000, both are more than enough of an initial nest egg to fully fund the retirement of a single man. Opportunity costs. Ask yourself a simple question. Even though you may not be married or some middle-aged 50-year-old right now, how many of you would go back in time to tell your 18-year-old self to, number 1, spend less time chasing girls, number 2, spend that time instead working more and making more money, and number 3, take said money and invest it in the S&P 500? And even though you may not know the precise math of it, it's pretty much a guarantee that every man reading this book, let alone every man in the world, wishes he could tell his younger self to have done precisely that. Invest more in himself, less in women, and park the savings in the market. This opportunity cost is theoretical. Neither you, nor I, nor most men in the world had the wisdom or maturity to stop wasting money chasing girls and invest it instead in the stock market. But it is still a price we paid, in that if we did not chase women, the resulting savings technically would have gone somewhere, some of which may be into an S&P 500 indexed fund. And though we could debate that we would have likely frittered it away on video games or travel, to attach a price tag to the opportunity we forfeited, theoretically parking said savings into the S&P 500, is a very logical and financially sound assumption. And so had you taken the $260,000 you spent chasing women and invested it instead in the S&P 500 index starting at 18 with an inflation-adjusted 8.64% return per year until you lived the average male life expectancy of 79 years, you would have $9,685,096. $9,424,311 more than the $260,000 you spent chasing girls. That $9.4 million is your opportunity cost in chasing women, though if you avoided divorce, this drops down to only $6.9 million. Of course, the real opportunity cost is not necessarily the money, but what you could have done with it. $9.4 million is of no value to a 79-year-old man because he's almost dead. But over the course of your life, what could you have done with that $9.4 million? Could you have traveled more? Could you have pursued more hobbies? What about work? And what about an entrepreneurial venture? Would you even need a job unless you wanted it? And what about all the psychological and physical health benefits that would come with the financial stability, peace, and calm that such money could afford? All those months you were worried about making rent or affording groceries would have never happened had you not been chasing girls. It's hard to put a price tag on such things. Intangible costs. Finally, there are intangible costs. Ask yourself another question. What would you pay to go back in time to prevent your 18-year-old self from suffering all the mental pain, anguish, and misery that came from being led on, being stood up, being strung along, being flaked on, being subjected to girls' fake bipolar episodes, being cheated on, the petty drama, the petty arguments, the stupid questions, the wife getting fat, the wife spending money, the arguments about money, the hoarding of worthless shit, arguing about the kids, being nagged, being told where to park, getting divorced, going through divorce, suffering from divorce, and being hounded about who does more household chores. And what any man who has the slightest bit of experience with women will tell you is that money is only one form of price you pay. Arguably the smaller of prices, as men pay an incredible mental and emotional price when it comes to pursuing women. From the time your little heart is kicked in when you're first stood up by a girl at 14, to the crushing depression that comes when your ex won't let you see your children as she's banging the guy she left you for, there is absolutely no doubt that men pay dearly in terms of stress, strife, frustration, heartache, confusion, and other mental suffering. Unfortunately, these intangible costs are often played down by society, including men themselves, as they instinctively throw up the facade of invincibility or machismo. But the prices they pay are very real. When a 15-year-old boy is stood up by a girl who lied to him, you might laugh at that today, but it was devastating to you then. We do the same thing when we jokingly reminisce about the mandatory bipolar girl every American man must date once, but in the thick of it, it was nothing short of psychotic and traumatic. We can roll our eyes when a man complains about his nagging wife, but nagging is nothing more than the slow murdering of his marriage via a death by 1,000 cuts. Related, your wife getting fat can be expected, even laughed at by your buddies, but it's nothing short of your entire sex life ending. And unless you've been there, you can't even fathom just how completely destructive it is to a man's mental health to get cheated on, get divorced, and lose his kids. When you consider that these are everyday normal things that nearly every man will face in his life, your average man is incredibly fortunate if he comes out of life suffering mere anxiety or depression. Most men are guaranteed to suffer a crippling bout of depression. Most men are indeed going to suffer actual trauma. Most men have a constant cortisol dump into their adrenal system. Consequently, most men today are likely suffering from some low-level form of PTSD resulting from their pursuit of women. And it should shock no one that, as a consequence, men die earlier, either of natural causes or, more tragically, by their own hand. These intangible costs cannot be measured, but they can be acknowledged. You are guaranteed to pay some kind of mental, psychological, or emotional price in your pursuit of women. But if you need to somehow put a price tag on these costs, it is almost guaranteed that most men today would gladly pay the cash price of $260,000 or opportunity cost of $9.4 million to have avoided suffering these costs in their own lives. Losing your family, having no sex life, nagging, getting strung along, or just the torturing confusion all men have suffered in their youth is enough to ruin any man's life. And if your life is ruined, then you really have nothing at all. Total costs. When you consider the explicit, opportunity, and intangible costs, the total costs of the pursuit of women can be summed up in one word: total. We can bat around cleverly calculated numbers, speculating about theoretical financial concepts like opportunity costs, but when you tally up the average amount a man will invest in the pursuit of women, both in terms of time, money, and mental energies, the price is total. It is complete. Men will essentially spend their entire lives in the pursuit of women. And this is perfectly expected, as men are more or less compelled to. Disagree with it all you want. Men are inextricably linked to women, and women to men, through genetics and biology. This dooms you to at least pay some intangible amorphous price to them because, at minimum, you are forced by nature to be attracted to them sexually, some of which you will fall in love with romantically and be vested in the children you have with them genetically. Due to the binary nature of the sexes, men are compelled to derive most of their value from women, and women from men, which means nature will force an unavoidable price upon you. The real issue is whether the costs are now so great, and the return so little, it's enough to override a man's biological programming. That the economics of the proposed transaction is so bad and so risky it pits a man's survival against his desire to reproduce or fall in love. And when presented with this modern-day male Black Widow paradox, it should surprise no one if most men ignore the 2 million years of human evolution screaming at them to breed, and instead maybe just pour themselves a scotch as they enjoy a quiet night watching Kelly's Heroes. Because while it would be nice to have a supporting, loving wife, one who remains svelte and takes care of the children, that lottery ticket is not only increasingly rare, but openly mocked and detested in today's society. Just ask young women today if they want to stay home and raise the children while cooking you a meal. Instead, most men are nearly guaranteed a costly life of penury, destitution, divorce, poverty, headache, heartache, nagging, confusion, and technical enslavement, coming from an obese woman no less. And when you consider that statistical reality, the whole point and purpose of human existence be damned. Not at those prices.